in the cold steel skies of the early 1940s. When the world was locked in a deadly dance of fire and iron, one man dared to imagine the impossible. His name would echo in whispers across airfields and briefing rooms, a man some called a genius and others called mad. He was a bomber pilot, a mechanic of destruction, but also a dreamer in the age of war. The Second World War had changed everything about air combat. Fighters dueled in tight spirals of death. Bombers flew in formation, raining devastation below. But in the midst of this organized chaos, one pilot believed that the bomber itself could be transformed into a weapon unlike any other. His idea? 2 bolt cannons, massive ground-shaking guns directly onto his bomber, turning it into a flying artillery platform capable of annihilating tanks, ships, and fortifications in one terrible strike. His commanders laughed. Engineers shook their heads. "It will never fly," they said. "The recoil alone will tear the wings off." But to this pilot, logic was the language of the timid. He had seen the way war was evolving, and he knew that victory would belong not to those who followed the rules, but to those who broke them. He studied the enemy's strengths, their armored divisions rolling across Europe like steel storms, and he understood something that few others did. Traditional bombing runs were blunt instruments, effective, yes, but imprecise. Fighters could strafe tanks, but their bullets bounced off the thick armor like raindrops on stone. The world needed a new kind of weapon, something that could pierce the very heart of mechanized warfare. And so, under cover of night, in hangars filled with oil and whispers, this pilot began to experiment. He stripped his bomber down to its bones, reinforcing its structure with spare parts scavenged from wrecks, and mounted massive cannons along its fuselage. Weapons so powerful they were meant for ground artillery, not flight. The first time he fired one, the bomber nearly tore itself apart. Rivets popped like bullets. The airframe shuddered violently, but he did not stop. Each test brought him closer to perfection, each failure teaching him how to tame the fury of his creation. To his fellow pilots, he was insane. To history, he would become a pioneer, a man whose madness would forever change the rules of air combat. When the first prototype took to the air, it was more beast than bird. The engines roared under the strain, and the nose, heavy with cannons, dipped as if the aircraft itself were reluctant to rise. But rise it did. The mad pilot sat in his cockpit, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursing through his veins. He wasn't just flying a plane anymore. He was riding a weapon, a machine of pure destruction. The ground crews gathered below, shielding their eyes from the sun, watching as the bomber banked across the horizon, its guns glinting like fangs in the light. Then came the moment of truth. The pilot aimed at a row of derelict tanks left as targets on the test range and squeezed the trigger. A thunderclap split the air. The bomber lurched violently backward, smoke trailing from the cannons. For a moment, everyone thought it would fall apart mid-air. But when the dust cleared, the tanks below were nothing but twisted wrecks, their armor punctured as though made of paper. The impossible had become real. Word spread like wildfire. Commanders who once mocked the pilot now demanded demonstrations. Engineers rushed to study his design, scribbling notes and sketches as he explained his modifications. The world was beginning to change. No longer was the bomber just a carrier of bombs. It had become a direct-fire weapon, capable of engaging targets with surgical precision. But success came at a price. The recoil forces were so intense that every shot risked catastrophic failure. The pilot's body was battered by vibration, his hands bruised from gripping the controls, yet he refused to quit. He fine-tuned his mountings, rebalanced the engines, and adjusted firing sequences to minimize the shock. Each improvement brought him closer to mastering his invention. He wasn't just fighting the enemy anymore, he was fighting physics itself. Every time he flew, every round he fired, the line between genius and insanity grew thinner. The higher command began to see the potential. The mad pilot's bomber could change the course of the air war. For the first time, the skies had birthed a machine that could hunt the ground, not just from above, but with the power of a tank destroyer in the clouds. As the new cannon-armed bombers entered limited production, the battlefield began to shift. Enemy tank commanders started to dread the sound of engines high above, knowing that somewhere, miles away, a pilot with a mad glint in his eye might be diving toward them with twin cannons blazing. The destruction was surgical, horrifyingly effective. Whole armored columns were halted, bridges obliterated, supply convoys reduced to ash. The bombers' guns could tear through tanks, trucks, and even small ships with terrifying precision. And it was indeed just the hardware that had changed. It was the philosophy of warfare itself. For decades, air power had been defined by altitude and bombs dropped from afar. But now, thanks to this one man's audacity, pilots began to think differently. Air combat was no longer about who could carry more bombs. It was about who could aim, strike, and destroy faster than the enemy could react. The lines between fighter and bomber began to blur, giving birth to the very concept of the gunship. The attack aircraft, and later, the close air support doctrine that modern militaries still rely on today. But with innovation came sacrifice. The mad pilot himself rarely spoke of glory. He knew the dangers of his creation better than anyone. Each flight was a gamble with death. One misfire, one structural failure, and his bomber could disintegrate midair. There were days when the recoil shattered the cockpit glass. Other times, the strain snapped bolts and twisted metal like paper. Still, he flew not for medals or fame, but for conviction. He believed that to win the future, one had to risk everything in the present. His legacy spread beyond his squadron, inspiring others across nations to reimagine what was possible in aerial warfare. Decades later, when jet aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II would take to the skies firing massive, 30mm cannons at ground targets, engineers would trace their conceptual roots back to that same wild idea, the bomber that became a gun. The man who once defied orders had unknowingly sketched the blueprint for the future of air dominance. History would not remember him with parades or statues. His name, for many, was lost in the pages of classified reports and forgotten journals. But his influence endured in every modern aircraft that bore a gun beneath its wings. The mad pilot had proven something fundamental about war, that progress is born not from obedience, but from defiance. The idea that one man, armed with courage and vision, could change the very fabric of aerial combat remains one of the most powerful stories in military history. From his cannon-mounted bomber would evolve entire generations of aircraft. Gunships, like the AC-130, attack planes like the IL-2 Sturmovik and a 10 Warthog, each a descendant of his madness. His story reminds us that genius often wears the mask of insanity, that the thin line between the two is drawn only by time. Even today, as stealth bombers glide unseen and drones strike from across continents, the spirit of that lone pilot lingers in every cockpit, every test flight, every bold idea that dares to challenge convention. His bomber, battered and experimental, was not just a machine, it was a symbol of what humanity can achieve when driven by pure, unrelenting innovation. The man they once called mad had seen the future long before anyone else could imagine it. And in doing so, he changed air warfare forever. A story like the sound of his cannons still echoes across the ages, a reminder that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that truly take flight.